Hey everyone, today we are looking into the life of one of the most famous bearded ladies of the 19th century, Annie Jones Elliot. From birth, she was exhibited in so-called freak shows of abnormal looking individuals, and although we might question the morality of these shows today, there is no doubt that they were very popular in their day. This is her story. Annie Jones Elliot was born as just Annie Jones on the 14th of July 1865 in Smith County in Virginia. Her parents, and anyone who saw her at this time, were immediately struck by her appearance, for Annie had been born with a good-sized moustache, already beginning to develop on her face, and some stubble around her chin, where a man would usually develop facial hair in later life. And as the weeks and months went by, this facial hair continued to expand. What could explain this? Annie was most likely suffering from hirsutism, or some closely related version of the condition. Hirsutism is a condition which results in excessive amounts of hair growing on various parts of the body. The condition is typically caused by an underlying endocrine imbalance of an adrenal, ovarian or central kind. These imbalances can result in excessive testosterone being produced in the woman's system, and consequently the growth of facial hair. Alternatively, Annie might have been suffering from hypertrichosis, a related condition which tends to produce intense hair growth in localized parts of the body. Moreover, hypertrichosis is more often congenital and present from the sufferer's birth, as was the case with Jones. Sufferers of hirsutism and hypertrichosis today have a range of treatment options available to them. However, these were not available to women such as Annie Jones, who suffered from irregular hair growth in the 19th century. As a result, bearded ladies were a more common sight in cities of the 19th century than they would be today. Moreover, in some particular instances, they were the centre of so-called freak shows in the United States and many European countries. There is a long history of bearded women and other people with odd appearances being considered sources of amazement and used as spectacles. For instance, during the 16th and 17th centuries, individuals with dwarfism and gigantism were often employed as spectacles at Europe's royal courts. Later, these spectacles at royal courts were adopted as the basis for the sideshows of the 19th century. These were effectively circuses featuring people who suffered from many different ailments, which rendered their appearances highly unusual. And by the time that Annie Jones was born in 1865, the bearded woman or bearded lady was a staple of such shows across America and in other countries such as Britain. In an age when the cause of conditions such as hirsutism and hypertrichosis was not understood, it is unsurprising to learn that Annie's parents were somewhat perturbed by their daughter's appearance. However, their dismay soon gave way to relief when an opportunity presented itself shortly after Annie's birth. When she was just a few months old, word reached P.T. Barnum about the infant girl who was already sporting a beard. Barnum was an American showman who had emerged in New York City in the 1830s as the director of Barnum's Grand Scientific and Musical Theatre. Thereafter, he branched out in the 1840s to running Scudder's American Museum, a venue which featured such oddities as General Tom Thumb, a dwarf who even in his adult years stood just over 3 foot tall, and Chang and Eng, a pair of Siamese twins who were extremely argumentative. Barnum was always on the lookout for a new attraction, and so, when he got word of Annie Jones's beard in infancy, he made contact with her parents. Eventually, Annie joined Barnum's New York-based exhibition when she was just 9 months old. Her parents, who were poor Virginians, agreed to allow this on the basis that Barnum would pay them a fee while Annie was in the show. Annie thus ended up in New York in 1866, where she was billed as Infant Esau. The name Esau was one which was regularly applied to individuals suffering from Hirsutism in the 19th century, and is a reference to the biblical character Esau, who was a grandson of Abraham and brother of Jacob. Esau featured in the book of Genesis, where he was specifically noted for his hairiness at birth. The initial run in New York City generated a lot of attention, and Barnum subsequently reached a deal with Annie's parents that she would continue to feature in his shows, and they would receive a fee of $150 per week for as long as she continued as part of the museum. This was a very considerable amount of money by the standards of the mid-19th century, and Annie's parents agreed. Initially, Annie's mother went to live with her in New York. However, within a few months, a family emergency of some kind appears to have required her to head back to Virginia, and Annie was placed under the charge of a nanny in the big city, one appointed by Barnum. It was during this period that Annie was very briefly kidnapped by a phrenologist, a proponent of a 19th century pseudoscience, which argued that intellectual development could be understood by studying the physical properties of somebody's head and torso. Luckily, however, Annie was soon recovered in upstate New York. The phrenologist was prosecuted, and Annie's mother returned to New York to oversee her care. In 1868, when Annie was 3 years old, the building which housed Scudder's American Museum burned down. As a result, P.T. Barnum decided to retire, a decision which briefly had implications for Annie. However, in just a short time, Barnum was tempted back into show business, and a new travelling show called P.T. Barnum's Great Travelling Museum, Menagerie, Caravan and Hippodrome was set up, though it is more commonly known today as the greatest show on earth. In the years that followed throughout the 1870s, Annie travelled across America with it, billed as Infant Esau, and then as she grew older, the bearded girl, the bearded lady, and finally, the bearded woman. Already by this time in the early 1870s, her moustache and beard had expanded to a full beard and sideburns. As she grew older and became aware of how it was that she was actually making her living, Annie also decided to grow out her hair to match the unusualness of her beard. Eventually, her hair grew to be 6 foot long, and she could hold large tranches of it in her own hands in her lap. Eventually, she gained such notoriety for being one of the most famed bearded ladies of the age that in the course of the 1870s, 1880s and 1890s, Annie Jones was photographed and featured in many magazines and posters across America and Europe. As the years went by, Annie continued to feature in Barnum's show. In 1880 or 1881, when she was still a teenager, Annie married for the first time. Her husband was one Richard Elliot, a member of the circus, not as a sideshow, but as a barker, someone who was hired to stand outside on the street and proclaim loudly about the wonders that were to be seen inside in order to draw passers-by in. Elliot was many years older than Annie, and her parents did not approve of the relationship, but the marriage went ahead in any event, and Annie Jones became Annie Jones Elliot. Despite her parents' disapproval, the marriage was also to last 15 years, before she and Elliot divorced in 1895. In the interim, P.T. Barnum died in 1891. He had only played a marginal role in the greatest show on earth for some years, as he was in his 70s during the 1880s, and the circus had largely been run in these years by James Anthony Bailey and his associates, with whom Barnum had joined in 1881. Thus, into the 1890s, and up to her divorce, Annie was mainly dealing with Bailey following Barnum's death. The divorce in 1895 prompted a major sea change in Annie's life. She was now 30 years of age and had never known any life other than the circus. She wasn't about to change her profession, but she did begin to articulate concerns about the use of the term freak show to describe the kinds of travelling circuses that she had been around her entire life. In the years that followed, she campaigned extensively to try and convince individuals such as Bailey and the operators of other major circuses in America, such as the Ringling Brothers, to abandon the use of the word freak in their shows. It was also shortly after the breakdown of her first marriage and divorce that Annie married William Donovan, who, like Elliot, was a barker or talker who stood around outside to entice in customers. Annie had known Donovan since they were children, having grown up together in the circus, and her shifting relationship with him seems to have led directly to her divorcing Elliot. This prompted further changes, and shortly after, she and William Donovan were married. The newlywed couple then left the Bailey and Barnum circus and decided to go out on their own as a duo act. They wouldn't be as well known as the circus they had just left, but they had their own independence for some time, travelling not just in America, but also in Europe. Donovan died just 4 years into their marriage, and being robbed of her husband and business partner, Annie decided to return to familiar surroundings and rejoined the Bailey and Barnum circus in 1900. She continued her activism against the use of the word freak in sideshow circuses, but her activity in this regard was cut short just 2 years later. While visiting her mother in Brooklyn in 1902, she became ill. Her condition deteriorated rapidly from what was almost certainly an aggressive form of tuberculosis. When she died on the 22nd of October 1902, she was just 37 years of age. The so-called freak shows, which she had been a part of for her whole life, continued to be a feature of American and European circuses and shows for another 30 years. But from the 1920s, they gradually became less popular as our scientific understanding of issues like hirsutism improved and people became more sympathetic towards such abnormalities. Thank you everyone for watching this video on Annie Jones Elliot. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on so you get all my content as soon as I upload it. And if you have any suggestions, be sure to leave them down in the comments. That's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.